KGB and then against the West. Putin had, to some degree, retained some of the influence of the liberal Sobchak. But eventually, said Pugachev, the inner circle made him. They changed him into someone else. He got disappointed in the US, and then he just wanted to get rich. It was the inner circle who pushed him to restore the state. The FSB chief Patrushev, in particular, had sought to tie Putin to the KGB security clan and its Cold War views. He'd been more senior than Putin within the FSB, holding top posts in the Moscow security services for most of the 90s. And when Putin was elevated, first to FSB director and then to the presidency, he was sceptical and believed he could manipulate him. He was always the most decisive. Putin was nothing compared to him, said a Kremlin insider. Patrushev wanted to bind Putin to the presidency so he would not ever be able to step away. He'd begun to do so from the very beginning of Putin's run for the presidency, with the apartment bombings that led to the Chechen War. But for the first year, the Yeltsin family seemed oblivious to this strand of Putin's background, or, believing that their own position had been secured, they did not want to know. All the while, Pugachev moved in the shadows, watching over his protégé like a hawk, trying to balance the influence of the opposing forces, the Yeltsin family and the security men, over the president. He attempted to shield Putin from attempts to bribe him, he said, instead paying for everything he needed himself. In Putin's first year in office, Pugachev said that he spent $50 million on meeting the Putin's family's every need, down to buying the cutlery they used in their home. He bought apartments for prosecutors in order to make sure they were under the president's and his control. He insisted that this was essential to make sure the president and his prosecutors remained uncorrupted. There were always people proposing he take money for this or for that. Mostly, it was done through Yuri Kovalchuk, he said, referring to the St. Petersburg ally who'd taken over Bank Russia, the main cash pot for Putin's St. Petersburg allies. Pugachev claimed that he was trying to bring an end to the era when the oligarchs of the Yeltsin years believed they controlled the Kremlin by giving donations to Kremlin officials, not realizing, perhaps, that essentially he was doing exactly the same. I was just trying to make sure this didn't happen. The rules had to have changed, he said. When Putin took over the presidency, the might of the Yeltsin-era oligarchs was still strong. The Moscow businessmen who'd been propelled through the first market experiments of the Perestroika era with the support of the KGB had by then long broken free from their former masters to emerge at the top of Russian power. They'd taken over a considerable swathe of the country's economy when they took advantage of Yeltsin's vulnerability on the eve of the 1996 elections and persuaded him to hand over the crown jewels of the nation's industry. The loans for shares auctions had consolidated nearly 50% of Russia's wealth in the hands of 7 businessmen, while Yeltsin was left ever more dependent and weak. He depended, in part, on funds from the oligarchs to secure his re-election in 1996, and they'd grown used to a role where they not only supported, but dictated some of the rules to the regime. An estimated $20 billion in cash had flooded into bank accounts in the West every year since 1994. While the Yeltsin government coffers had been bled dry. The funds that oligarchs like Khodorkovsky and Berezovsky had stowed abroad had weakened the Russian state to such a degree that Putin's KGB men argued the country was on the brink of collapse. In the 90s, wage arrears had mounted, while paying taxes was almost universally avoided. Russia had fallen deep in debt to Western institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank, and the $40 billion debt default, more than a third of which was to foreign creditors, had tarnished the country's finances even more. In the KGB men's view, the political freedoms Yeltsin had granted to the regions had brought the country even closer to the brink. Amidst the political tumult of Yeltsin's final year, some regional governors had refused to transfer part of their tax take to the federal government. We saw how the country was disintegrating, said Sergei Bogdanchikov, a close Putin ally who served as head of the one remaining state oil company Rosneft and had also been close to Primakov. What Putin took over was no more than fragments of the state. Things had gone so far that some governors were talking about introducing their own currency. If Putin had not come and another 2-3 years passed, we would not have had the Russian Federation. There would have been separate states like the Balkans. The collapse was absolutely clear to me. The KGB men had long been looking at the situation intently. Vladimir Yakunin, the bluff former senior KGB officer who'd served undercover at the United Nations in New York and then taken over Bank Russia on his return to Leningrad, had prepared a study on the ownership of the Russian economy, which found that in 1998 to 99, almost 50% of the nation's gross domestic product was produced by companies owned by just 8 families. If things stayed that way, then they would soon control more than 50%, says Yakunin now, nearly 20 years later. All the profits were going into private pockets. No taxes were paid. It was looting, pure and simple. Without greater state involvement, it was clear to me it was a path to nowhere. Yakunin, who'd been close to Putin since they'd shared the Ozero Dacha compound, said he'd handed the report with his comments to Putin soon after he took the presidency. But for Putin's security men, the Yeltsin-era oligarchs' sending of cash to the West provided a useful argument for shoring up their own power. They could claim that the dominance of the oligarchs was a threat to national security, though it was mostly a threat to their own positions. They saw themselves as the anointed guardians of Russia's restoration as an imperial power, and believed that the resurgence of the state and their own fates were inextricably and conveniently linked. Soon after Putin's inauguration, Yakunin recalled, Zbigniew-Brzezinski, the Cold War-era U.S. National Security Advisor, had scoffed when discussing the cash held in overseas accounts by the Russian elite. If all that money was in accounts in the West, he said, then whose elite was it? Russia's or the West's? Brzezinski's comments had scalded the KGB men's ears. It was all the more rankling to hear them from a Cold War warrior like him, who they regarded as one of the architects of the West's efforts to dismantle the Soviet regime. None of the oligarchs' arrangements had seemed more odious to the KGB men than the billions that ran through Valmet, the offshore fund co-owned by Khodorkovsky's advisor Christian Michel. With branches in London, Geneva and the Isle of Man, it managed the foreign bank accounts of Khodorkovsky's Menatep group, as well as the Swiss oil trader Runicom, which exported oil from Sibneft, the Russian oil major belonging to Boris Berezovsky and Roman Abramovich. Khodorkovsky and Berezovsky were two of the most independent oligarchs, and in many ways Valmet had come to represent the new post-Cold War order, in which the US reigned supreme and Russian money from the by-then independent oligarchs fled to Western bank accounts. This status was underlined when one of the oldest and most venerable banks in the US, Riggs National Bank of Washington, bought a 51% stake in Valmet. The bank, which for decades had held the accounts of US embassies across the globe, was seeking to expand into Eastern Europe and Russia, and Valmet was its vehicle for doing so. The symbolism of the West's Cold War victory ran deep. Riggs's chief of international banking was a former US ambassador to NATO, Alton G. Keel, who saw his mission as helping foster private enterprise in previously hostile climates. Christian Michel, meanwhile, an avowed libertarian, was convinced that Riggs Valmet's operations were contributing to an effort to free Russian entrepreneurs from the weighty hand of the Russian state. And when Khodorkovsky's Menatep took a stake in Riggs Valmet too, Michel believed that the investment represented a wonderful symbol of the New World Order that President Bush Sr. was so proud of, the oldest US bank and an upcoming Russian bank sharing in the capital of Valmet. I thought it was a coup. But in the eyes of the St. Petersburg KGB men and the generals who backed them, the Riggs-Menatep tie-up was a symbol of the Yeltsin era, a Western-backed gangster capitalism in which oligarchs like Khodorkovsky had been able to dictate their will to power. They viewed Anatoly Chubais, the architect of Russia's privatization program, in particular as a stooge of the West. In the Cold War mindset of the KGB men, for whom almost every action was part of a zero-sum game, the American economists who flocked to Russia to advise Chubais must have been agents of the CIA, bent on destroying what remained of Russian industry as, with their assistance, it passed into private hands, while the defense industry was dismantled piece by piece. The KGB had sought to retain control of industrial cash flows, but under Chubais's watch, the nation's enterprises had been broken up and transferred to independent hands. The US sent senior CIA people to Russia to help to negotiate the privatization process, said one close Putin associate, who, more than 20 years after Chubais's privatization program began, was still livid about it. They took advantage of this process and made money out of it. They had no right to make money in this privatization. For all his declarations about backing Russia's further transition to a market economy, Putin had in fact made his feelings about the oligarchs clear from the start of his election campaign. The first hint came at the end of February, when he answered a question from a campaign worker about when he was going to waste the leeches, meaning the oligarchs that had attached themselves to power. He replied that his regime needed to do more than just destroy them. It is extremely important to create equal conditions for all, so no one can fasten onto power and use these advantages for themselves. Not a single clan, not a single oligarch. All should be equally distanced from power. The next warning came a week before the election, when he told a Moscow radio station he wanted to eliminate the oligarchs. Such a class of oligarchs will cease to exist. Unless we ensure equal conditions for all, we won't be able to pull the country out of its current state. Such statements, of course, were cheered by a population tired of the excesses of the Yeltsin years and fed a daily diet of corruption stories by a relatively free media that was being used by its independent tycoon owners as a means of battering their rivals. Putin was echoing the line first drawn by Primakov when he called for space to be freed in the country's jails for businessmen and corrupt officials. But while Primakov's statement had sent a chill through the Yeltsin family, when Putin made such comments, they seemed oblivious. He was their agent in the Kremlin, and they felt sure he would never touch them. The inner circle and the oligarchs thought he was a temporary figure, and they really thought they could take him under control, said one person close to Putin. Ahead of the presidential election, one oligarch had apparently gone to see Putin in the White House, the seat of the Russian government, where he still kept his office, and told him in no uncertain terms that he should know he would never be elected without their support, and that he should therefore understand how to behave. Putin barely batted an eyelid and merely replied, "We'll see." He didn't throw anyone out of his office, but of course he was playing with them. They absolutely underestimated him. Boris Berezovsky was probably the oligarch who went to see Putin. At the time, he seemed to be the only one who was beginning to wonder if they'd made a fatal mistake. After completing his effort to destroy the Primakov-Luzhkov tandem, he'd been holidaying on Anguilla with a new girlfriend for most of the presidential election campaign. When he arrived back, he'd clearly been distressed by the changes he saw. He came back from holiday and something happened he didn't like, said one person close to him. He'd gone to see Putin to agree on who would be president in 2004. He proposed Putin would only be president for 4 years, while he, Berezovsky, would work on creating an opposition party. He wanted there to be a real democracy. But if this conversation took place, it evidently did not go well. Days before Putin's inauguration, Berezovsky's Kommersant newspaper raised the alarm with an article leaking what it said were plans to merge the Kremlin with the FSB, with the aim of muzzling opposition parties, all critics, and the free press. Although such a merger never formally occurred, the plans the article described seem ominously prescient now. Putin's rise to power did of course amount to the takeover by the KGB of the Kremlin. The two entities really were to be fused. It was as if Berezovsky had suddenly realized the depths of his mistake. The new president, if he really wants to ensure order and stability, does not need a self-regulating political system, the alleged Kremlin blueprint read. Instead, he needs a political structure in his administration that can clearly control the political and social processes in the Russian Federation. The intellectual, personnel, and professional potential of the FSB should be brought into work on controlling the political process. The FSB would be used for damage control when information surfaced that wasn't in the interests of the president or his inner circle. The Kremlin denied that any such proposals were under discussion. But just 4 days after Putin's inauguration, Phase 1 of the plan seemed to be put into play. It was clearly aimed at bringing the media to heel. Masked police commandos with automatic weapons had swarmed through the offices of Vladimir Gazinsky, the tycoon who owned the Media Most empire, which included the television channel NTV, Putin's most vocal critic. NTV was Russia's second most popular channel, and Gazinsky had never been afraid to use it for political ends, deploying it in support of Luzhkov's fatherland bloc in the parliamentary elections. The channel had also been a strident voice of independence, probing Putin's Chechen war. On the eve of the presidential election, it aired a primetime discussion on the suspicious incident in Ryazan, and openly questioned whether the FSB was behind the apartment bombings. Its weekly satirical show, Kukli, or Puppets, was a constant thorn in Putin's side. On more than one occasion, it wryly portrayed him as an ungainly dwarf from an E.T.A. Hoffmann fairy tale named Zatches, who inherited a ready-made kingdom of great riches through no effort of his own. The raid on Gazinsky was not the only powerful signal from the Kremlin's new KGB masters in the first few days of Putin's rule. 10 days after his inauguration, Putin unveiled sweeping new plans to rein in the powers of Russia's regional governors. Measures clearly intended to ensure that the elected governors would never again unite against the Kremlin as they had on behalf of Luzhkov and Primakov. The proposed legislation would take away the governors' seats in the Federation Council, the upper chamber of Parliament where they dug in for so long to block the removal of Skudetov as Prosecutor General, essentially becoming an independent political force. The removal of the governors' seats would take away their immunity from prosecution, while the proposed measures would also allow the president to dismiss any regional governor into whom a criminal investigation was opened, a move clearly aimed at making sure they never again departed from the Kremlin line. As a further development of Kremlin control, Putin also proposed 7 Kremlin-appointed plenipotentiaries, sort of super-governors, who would oversee 7 swathes of territory. 7 generals from the army and the FSB were promptly anointed to the posts. To Berezovsky, this legislation represented a dangerous dismantling of the democratic achievements of the Yeltsin era. On May the 31st, he wrote an open letter to Putin protesting that the proposals were a threat to Russia's territorial integrity and democracy. The letter made the front page of almost all of Moscow's newspapers, while the Berezovsky-controlled TV channel ORT gave its first billing on the evening news. One of his friends, a business tycoon who'd always been close to the security men, in particular to Primakov, warned him he'd better pipe down. I said, "That's enough, Borya. What are you doing? Your guy became president. What more do you want?" But Berezovsky had answered, "He's a dictator." He saw that he was a dictator before everyone. But back then, Berezovsky was the lone canary in the coal mine warning about the demise of democracy. Officials close to the Yeltsin family who were running the Kremlin, namely the Chief of Staff Alexander Voloshin and his baby-faced deputy Vladislav Surkov, had been among the chief architects of the project to bring the regional governors to heel. Behind the scenes, they'd also thrown their backing behind plans to rein in the media. It was as if they were taking revenge on the forces that had nearly had them jailed, and had caused them so much angst just 12 months before. Yumashev insisted that when Putin raised the matter with him, he told him that any attack on NTV went against the grain of freedom of speech. But neither he nor Voloshin did anything to stop what was to become a campaign to bring the TV channels under the control of the state, while Voloshin actively participated in it. "Putin told me that Yeltsin will be tainted in the history books," Yumashev recalled. He said, "All the books will tell of the family, and it will be one lie after the other because of NTV." Putin said, "Why should I put up with this? Why should we allow them to discredit the regime? Why should I put up with this if they're going to lie every day?" I told him freedom of speech was the most important institution of power. We need to remember this. But he said this should never be tolerated when the regime is weak. It can be tolerated when the regime is strong, but when it is weak, it can never be stomached. And then he acted as he considered necessary. The way Putin steered the conversation was a typical KGB manipulation. He was stirring up the Yeltsin family's visceral antipathy towards NTV after they'd been subjected to its unforgiving spotlight over the corruption scandals that had plagued and humiliated them the previous year, eventually forcing them into their hasty handover of power. He exploited their fears about how this would impact their legacy to manipulate them into giving their backing for an attack on the channel. He considered this was a TV company that was involved not in informing people, but in lobbying for the interests of its owner, said Yumashev. He said, "They've been caught. They took a loan from the state." He said, "If there was not this loan, I wouldn't have touched them, but they've been compromised, and therefore we need to use this." The raid on Gazinsky's Media Most was the beginning of an all-out campaign by Putin's Kremlin, Voloshin, and the officials of the Yeltsin family included, against many of the oligarchs of the Yeltsin era. It was the launch of Putin's efforts to eradicate challenges to his power. All that was needed was for a target to be compromised in some way, and now that Putin's men had taken over the apparatus of law enforcement, it was not hard to find something to latch onto after the hurly-burly transition of the Yeltsin years. What followed that summer was a well-planned series of coordinated raids aimed at scaring the tycoons out of politics that were carried out with KGB precision. First, less than a month after the raid on Media Most, Gazinsky was jailed. Though he was held for just 3 nights in Moscow's notorious Butyrka prison, charged with embezzling $10 million from the state, For the oligarchs who had grown used to their near-untouchable status during Yeltsin's rule, the unthinkable had happened. Kaczynski, a garrulous, larger-than-life figure, had always been able to use his media to criticize the authorities and get away with it. The tycoons united to fire off a joint letter in protest at Kaczynski's arrest, calling it an act of vengeance against a political opponent. But if any of them were thinking of rebelling against the new regime, they were soon to get a new warning. A week later, Moscow prosecutors filed suit to contest the 1997 privatization of Norilsk Nickel, the sprawling $1.5 billion nickel producer that had been sold for a mere $170 million in the controversial loans for shares auctions to Vladimir Potanin, the architect of the privatization scheme. Igor Malyshenko, the first deputy chairman of Kaczynski's Media Most, warned that the suit indicated that any businessman involved in privatization could be thrown in prison tomorrow. A new order is being created in the country, which in the eyes of the new leadership means that everything has to be under the control of the Kremlin. As if to further underline the arrival of a new regime under which none of the tycoons' empires was safe, in early July, Putin's men launched 3 more raids in the space of 2 days. They first targeted Lukoil, the vast energy conglomerate owned and run by a wily Soviet-era official from Azerbaijan, Vagit Alekperov, accusing it of falsifying tax refunds. Then they raided Kaczynski's Media Most again, and for the first time its TV channel, NTV. The next day, it was the turn of another potent symbol of the capitalism of the Yeltsin era, the sprawling Avto, the nation's biggest car maker, which was controlled by associates of Berezovsky. The head of the tax police claimed that the company had evaded tax amounting to hundreds of millions of dollars. The panic in the business community was reaching fever pitch. On the same day that the tax police were swarming through Avto, Putin gave a television interview justifying the raids and vowing to bring justice to those who had made their fortunes in the muddy waters following the Soviet collapse. "We cannot confuse a democracy with anarchy," he warned. "In Russian, we have a saying about catching fish in muddy waters. There are fishermen who have already caught a lot of fish and would like to keep the system as it is. But I do not think this state of affairs is appreciated by our people." The next day, he gave a newspaper interview in which he claimed that the recent moves did not signal a return to a police state. But he added that business should observe the rules of the game, particularly now that he'd tabled the new 13% flat income tax rate that was supposed to support liberalizing efforts. It was a typical KGB tactic of bait and switch, and the well-oiled machinery of the Kremlin was being unfurled for Putin. The Kremlin's propaganda machine and law enforcement were working in near-perfect tandem, and the tycoons, desperate to understand the new rules of the game, were begging for a meeting with him. Khodorkovsky warned quietly that any of them could fall foul of post-Soviet laws as they'd been written in a contradictory way, and the judiciary was weak. Berezovsky again was the lone voice of protest. He'd noisily resigned his post as a member of parliament, telling a packed press conference that he didn't want to take part in the dismantling of Russia and the imposition of authoritarian rule. His stance was a desperate rallying cry to the other Moscow tycoons, but it came far too late. When 21 of the most powerful tycoons met Putin at the end of July, the encounter around the oval table of the Kremlin's ornate Yekaterinovsky Hall was a far cry from the cosy secret meetings they'd had with Boris Yeltsin. This was a formal affair, and it was a public dressing down. Putin's comments were televised across the nation as he told the magnates that they had only themselves to blame for the wave of tax police raids and criminal probes. "You must remember that you formed this state yourselves through the political and quasi-political structures that you controlled." Citing a Russian folk saying, he continued, "It's no use blaming the mirror if you have an ugly face." In the end, while he reassured them that he would not reverse the privatizations of the 90s, he exhorted them to support his economic program and to stop using their media outlets to politicize the legal probes against big business. After the TV cameras had left, he made the new rules of the game clear to them. They should stay out of politics or else. 2 of the tycoons were conspicuous by their absence, Berezovsky and Kaczynski, both of whom had publicly railed against Putin's policies and used their media empires to do the same. But another was conspicuous by his closeness. To Putin's right hand, from time to time whispering in his ear, was Sergei Pugachev. While the others quaked, he seemed unperturbed. In those days, while Putin was adjusting to his new role, the two men spoke many times a day. Later that day, at Pugachev's suggestion, Putin hosted the oligarchs for another gathering, away from the TV cameras, that was rich in symbolism. Pugachev had persuaded Putin to meet them in more informal circumstances, to demonstrate to them that he didn't want to go to war. But the setting Putin chose for the friendly barbecue was also meant as a pointed signal. Hidden in the woods on the outskirts of Moscow, Stalin's dacha had been kept almost untouched since the day he died there in 1953. The telephones down which the dictator barked orders remained in place. The couch on which he preferred to sleep instead of retiring to bed still stood in his study. Time seemed to have stood still, since Stalin had spent days and nights there, drawing up lists of enemies among the country's elite. The oligarchs had been invited to the place from which Stalin had ordered thousands to be sent to their deaths, in what became known as the Great Purge. Putin was dressed in t-shirt and jeans and was trying to appear relaxed and approachable. He'd only ever seen many of the tycoons on TV, said Pugachev, and he was still anxious about how to behave in front of them. But if Putin was uneasy, the tycoons were even more so. No one was going to challenge the new president there. It was enough that he let us leave, Pugachev remembered one of them saying. All the while, Pugachev had been operating behind the scenes. In those days, while the other oligarchs faced raids and tax police, he believed that he commanded all he surveyed. He'd installed his man as president and an ally as FSB chief. He'd personally brought in the new head of the Federal Tax Service, Gennady Bukayev, an associate from Bashkortostan, where he had interest in the oil sector. He'd helped to appoint Vladimir Ustinov as prosecutor general, as he sought to quash the investigations surrounding Mabatex. Pugachev liked to believe he controlled them all. Through his Mezprombank, he doled out cash left and right. An apartment for Ustinov here, an apartment for his deputy there. Other tycoons lined up to work with him. They were coming to me constantly saying, "Let's raid this guy and take over the business," he laughed, with a deep nostalgia for those days. Even Roman Abramovich, the seemingly shy, stubble-faced oil trader who'd begun as a protégé of Boris Berezovsky, but had now outmaneuvered him to gain favour with the Yeltsin family, bowed to him. Much later, Abramovich would complain to another tycoon that he'd had to agree everything with Pugachev in those days. One Moscow newspaper hailed Pugachev as the Kremlin's new favourite, while others called him the new Grey Cardinal, who together with Putin's KGB men from St. Petersburg was taking over financial flows. He was seen as an ideologue behind the new policy of keeping the oligarchs equally distant from power, an idea he'd never admit to now, but which then he seemed to subscribe to as long as he was above everyone else. While some oligarchs like Pugachev and Abramovich were clearly more equal than others, the chief threats to Putin's power were picked off one by one. Just days before Putin's Kremlin meeting with the Moscow tycoons, Kaczynski had been presented with an offer he couldn't refuse. He was told by Putin's new press minister, Mikhail Lezin, that he should agree to sell his Media-Most empire to the state-controlled gas monopoly Gazprom for $473 million in debts and $300 million in cash. Otherwise, he would face jail. The debts, which Putin had honed in on in his conversation with Yumashev, were mostly owed to the state gas giant, and Media-Most was behind on its payments. Kaczynski had quickly agreed. He didn't want to risk any more nights in the decrepit Butyrka jail. But by the time the tycoons gathered in the Kremlin, prosecutors had announced they'd dropped all charges against Kaczynski. But soon after, Kaczynski fled the country, and later he re-emerged saying he'd been forced to sign the deal under duress, practically at gunpoint. Therefore, he said, he was reneging on it. When news first emerged of the deal, the country's elite had been shocked. It was the first sign of how far Putin's regime was willing to go to acquire control over the independent media networks. Putin's men were using the criminal justice system as a weapon of crude blackmail to force through a takeover. For them, such tactics were par for the course. But for Putin, the final showdown with the media tycoons was yet to come. From the beginning, the Kremlin focused its efforts on them. Putin had become obsessed with the media's power, knowing all too well how, with the help of Berezovsky's TV channel, he'd been transformed from a nobody into the country's most popular leader. He was aware that without control of the country's federal TV channels, that could change at any minute. More than any of the other tycoons, Boris Berezovsky represented the archetypal oligarch of the Yeltsin era to Putin's men, by whom he was reviled, loathed, and feared in equal measure. He was the epitome of the insider dealing of the Yeltsin years, when a small coterie of businessmen bargained behind the scenes for prime assets and government posts. The ties he cultivated with the separatist leaders of Chechnya made him invidious in the eyes of the KGB men, especially Patrushev, who hated anyone connected with the Chechens. Berezovsky had backed separatist leader Aslan Maskhadov and helped forge a peace deal following Yeltsin's disastrous First Chechen War, in which thousands of Russian soldiers and many more Chechen civilians had lost their lives. The deal granted Maskhadov broad autonomy for a republic that, in the eyes of Putin's KGB men, had become a black hole for people and cash. Berezovsky had been able to navigate the treacherous clans of Chechen warlords to make money not just out of negotiating the release of hostages, but also out of the business of war. "He is a war criminal. He stole people," one Putin associate claimed. All this, the war, the Chechen warlords, was Berezovsky's work. But most of all, Putin's men feared the power of the media he ran. Even though his ORT TV channel was, on paper, controlled by the state, which held a 51% stake, Berezovsky, who owned the rest and had stacked the board with his allies, was in fact in charge. By early August, Berezovsky had moved into outright opposition to the new regime. The day after a terrorist bomb tore through an underpass in central Moscow, leaving 7 dead and 90 injured, he held a press conference to announce that he was creating an opposition bloc to combat what he called Putin's rising authoritarianism. He warned that more such blasts could occur if the Kremlin continued its dangerous push to destroy the rebels in Chechnya. With Berezovsky's ties to the Chechen rebels, it seemed he was laying down the gauntlet to the Putin regime. When disaster struck later that month, leaving Putin facing the first major crisis of his fledgling presidency, it became more urgent for the Kremlin's men to push Berezovsky out of the media game. A torpedo on board one of the country's nuclear submarines, the Kursk, had somehow detonated, sending an explosion ripping through it and sending it and its crew to the bottom of the sea. Berezovsky deployed the full force of his ORT TV channel to hurl criticism at how Putin handled the disaster. For 6 days, confusion reigned as he failed to publicly address the tragedy, remaining hidden away in his summer residence near Sochi on the Black Sea coast, only appearing, in footage shown by ORT, to frolic on a jet ski. Putin stayed totally silent, while the Navy obfuscated for days over what had happened, even after acknowledging that the submarine had sunk. The families of the crew were in despair. A rescue operation had only been haltingly mounted, and Russia had initially refused offers of international assistance, fearing the disclosure of secrets about the state of its nuclear fleet. Still an inexperienced leader, despite his years of work handling illegals against the West and his decisive military action in Chechnya, Putin was initially paralyzed by fear, one person close to him said. He was in a stupor. He went totally white. He didn't know how to deal with it, and therefore he tried to avoid dealing with it. We knew that it had exploded right away. We believed everyone was dead from the start. Putin just did not know how to deal with it. And so when everyone came and said, "What do you want us to do? Launch a rescue operation? Announce war against the US?" One of the claims had been that the Kursk had collided with a US submarine. He played for time. Even though we believed all were dead, we launched the rescue operation, and all the stories appeared about the plaintive cries of the submariners knocking on the walls. The Norwegians and others were calling in with offers of help. But he did not want them to uncover that everyone was dead, and so he just refused the help, which of course made everything worse. All the lies just made everything worse. On the 7th day, Putin flew quietly back to Moscow. But it was only 3 days later that he emerged in public. After much prodding and cajoling from advisers, he flew to Vidyayevo, a closed military city above the Arctic Circle where the Kursk had had its home port, and where the stricken relatives of the crew had gathered days ago in vain hopes of good news that had long descended into grief, anger, and despair. The day before, the Russian authorities had finally admitted that all 118 crewmen were dead, and Putin had already been taking a beating in the media over his inaction in handling the affair. Berezovsky's ORT led the charge, interviewing grief-stricken relatives who laid into Putin for his lack of leadership. Putin exploded in rage over the footage and claimed that his security men had given him a report saying that the women who appeared on screen were not wives or relatives, but prostitutes hired by Berezovsky to discredit him. But when Putin arrived in Vidyayevo, he was faced with a tirade of real-life anger as wives and relatives tore into him. The fury portrayed on Berezovsky's channel was genuine. Any suggestion that it had been staged was out of the question. Putin's initial reaction was another sign of his deep-seated paranoia and his lack of empathy. For 3 hours he spoke with them, trying to soothe their rage. Though he told them he was ready to take responsibility for everything that had happened in the country in the 100 days since he'd become president, he said he could not do the same for the previous 15 years. For this, I am ready to sit down next to you and pose these same questions to others. He blamed the bungled rescue operation on the parlous, pitiful state of the military, which had been left to decay with little funding during Yeltsin's rule. But most of all, he laid the blame at the feet of the media tycoons. Clearly targeting Berezovsky and Kaczynski, he lashed out at them as the real cause of the military's plight, for stealing from the country even as they sought to score political points out of the tragedy. There are people on television today who, over the last 10 years, destroyed the very army and fleet where people are dying now. They stole money, they bought the media, and they're manipulating public opinion. Eventually, Putin appeared to have won the relatives round. But his comments singling out the media tycoons as thieves who'd undermined the state signaled that any hope for Berezovsky's or Kaczynski's continued ownership of their independent media channels was dead. Again, the Berezovsky associate who retained ties with the security services had scolded his friend and warned him to back off. I said, "Borya, why are you undermining him and not giving him a chance? How can you blame him for the submarine?" But Berezovsky was unrepentant. He feared the rise of the KGB state and wanted to do everything he could to undermine it. After the Kursk episode, Voloshin told Berezovsky that his ownership of ORT was over, as he'd been found to be using the channel to work against the president. Then, according to Berezovsky, he told him he had to surrender his stake within 2 weeks or follow Kaczynski into Butyrka. He regarded this as an ultimatum that would lead to the end of television information in Russia. It will be replaced by television propaganda controlled by Kremlin advisors. For a time, he played an uneasy game of cat and mouse with the Kremlin, announcing that he'd handed his stake in ORT in trust to the channel's journalists, all the while proclaiming he would not allow the country to fall into an authoritarian abyss. For all Berezovsky's prescience, the Yeltsin holdovers in the Kremlin were working in lockstep with Putin and law enforcement. The Kremlin machine was united against Berezovsky and Kaczynski, and there was never going to be any chance for them. Gleb Pavlovsky, the Kremlin spin doctor who'd helped engineer some of the propaganda behind Putin's election campaign, had helped to create a new Kremlin information security doctrine, which, he said, would allow the government to remove shadow information brokers like Kaczynski and Berezovsky, who posed serious threats to the country's national interests. In mid-October, prosecutors reopened their case into allegations that Berezovsky had siphoned hundreds of millions of dollars through Swiss companies from Aeroflot, the Russian state airline he part-owned. The pressure became unbearable. When prosecutors announced on November the 13th that they were calling him in for questioning and that they were ready to charge him, Berezovsky fled Russia and said he would never return. "They have forced me to choose between becoming a political prisoner or a political émigré," he said in a statement from a location he would not disclose. The same tactics were used against Kaczynski. He'd also been called in for questioning on the same day, but he too was long gone, having fled out of the prosecutor's reach to his villa in Spain soon after he signed the deal to hand over his shares in Media Most in July. He then reneged on the deal, claiming it was signed under duress in exchange for a guarantee of his freedom. But he could not escape the long arm of the Russian prosecutors. They charged him in absentia with misrepresenting his assets in Media Most when he'd accepted loans from Gazprom and fired off an Interpol warrant for his arrest. Even in exile, the pressure became too much to bear for both men. In February 2001, on the insistence of Voloshin, Berezovsky sold his shares in ORT to Roman Abramovich, who'd abandoned his former partner to become a financial bridge between the Yeltsin family and Putin's men, and who promptly sold the shares to the state. In April that year, Gazprom seized control of Kaczynski's NTV, launching a boardroom coup as it called in a $281 million loan it had lent to Media Most. Putin and his men were flexing the tried and tested tactics of the St. Petersburg days, when all they'd had to do to take over the city's port and Baltic Sea Fleet was to have its director thrown in jail. But at that early stage of their rule, they would have been able to do little without the assistance of the Yeltsin holdovers in the Kremlin. They, the Yeltsin family, were the ones who thought up the schemes to bring all the media into the state's hands that led to the practical destruction of all independent media, said Leonid Nevzlin, the former Menatap tycoon who was closely watching the goings-on from the sidelines. They gave this to Putin. We should have concluded where all this was leading to in the first year of Putin's rule. But we wanted to continue looking through rose-coloured glasses because everything else in the economy seemed to be fine. Behind the wizard's curtain of Putin's Kremlin, behind the bombastic show of force, Putin had still been nervous, according to Pugachev. In January 2001, before the takeover of NTV by Gazprom, he'd invited the channel's top journalists to the Kremlin in an attempt to reassure them of the state's intentions. He was visibly fretful before he walked into the Kremlin library to greet them, Pugachev recalled. He was scared before the meeting. He didn't want to go in and speak with them. I had to tell him what to say. They were the cream of the Moscow intelligentsia, household names. Putin was so anxious that he pulled one of the journalists aside into a separate room and asked her what she wanted to hear, said Pugachev. For the past 4 years, Svetlana Sorokina had been the face of NTV's most popular political talk show, Glas Naroda, or Voice of the People. He told her, "You and I, we are both from St. Petersburg. We have that in common. Tell me how you would like it to be," Pugachev said. The other journalists waiting outside believed Putin had pulled Sorokina aside to wrong-foot them, to take the wind out of their sails. But Pugachev claimed it was because he had no idea what to say. It was also a classic tactic for recruiting allies. By the time Putin finally walked into the wood-panelled Kremlin library to greet the journalists, chameleon-like, he'd absorbed Sorokina's persona and was able to tell them exactly what they wanted to hear. It was another KGB operation. Over the next 3.5 hours, he sought to assure them of the Kremlin's benign intentions. The fight, he told them, was only with Gazinsky. He didn't want the channel's editorial staff to change. He would welcome a foreign investor in the channel. He wanted them to preserve their editorial independence. Gazprom, he assured them, was not the state. As for the prosecutors, who were now turning their attention to individual journalists' financial relations with Gazinsky, he could not control them. They were beyond his command. We found out that day that the prosecutor's office is an absolutely independent organization. Putin said it several times. One of the journalists, Viktor Shenderovich, later recalled of the meeting, barely believing what he'd heard. He said he's ready to help us and considers some of the prosecutor's actions excessive. Putin had told him, "You will not believe me, but there is nothing I can do. Do you want me to return to the times of telephone law?" A reference to how the Soviet Politburo had dictated judgments from on high to the courts and prosecutors. It was a command performance, typical of many Putin would later make in his insistence on observing the official, legal status of institutions while masking the real power games at play. He was at his most skilled when taking on the persona and concerns of others. It was a tactic he'd honed in Dresden. He was like a mirror, said Pugachev. He just tells everyone what they want to hear. Nevertheless, the journalists left the Kremlin uneasy. How could they believe what they'd just heard? And when Gazprom installed new management in early April on the grounds that Gazinsky had defaulted on his debts, they staged a sit-in to keep control of the station and continued to air reports critical of the Kremlin as if still half hoping that Putin had meant what he said. But early in the morning of the 11th day of their sit-in, Putin's true intentions became crystal clear. He'd meant nothing of what he said about preserving the channel's editorial independence. Security men quietly entered the building at 4 a.m. and replaced the channel's security force. Journalists arriving to work that morning were only allowed in if they swore loyalty to the new management. The senior journalist resigned en masse in protest at the strong-arm tactics that had seized their hard-won independence away from them. A creeping coup was taking place in the country, declared Igor Malyshenko, a co-founder of the channel. This operation is along the same lines as the attempted putsch in August 1991, and it is being carried out by the same people, members of the Secret Service. We are all guilty because we have let the KGB get back into power, Sergei Kovalyov, a prominent human rights activist, told reporters. Putin's Kremlin had taken back control of the airwaves. The freewheeling media of the Yeltsin years was no more. Chapter 7. Operation Energy. Far to the east of Moscow, beyond the Ural Mountains, where birch forest gives way to a taiga of fir trees and swamp, lies the vast flatland of the West Siberian oil basin. Ever since Soviet geologists discovered huge oil and gas reserves there in the 60s, the region had been the power behind the Soviet Empire's global ambitions. It was the key to the country's imperial might. The engineers, drillers, and geologists who developed the near-deserted territory had been lauded as Soviet heroes. They'd battled the ice and plunging temperatures of winter to build drilling rigs and pipelines across terrain that turned into impassable lakes and mosquito-infested bog during the summer months. Their labours helped turn the Soviet Union, for a time, into an economic powerhouse that by the end of the 80s became the world's biggest oil and gas producer. Production was recklessly ramped up to meet the ever greater demands of the Politburo. Wells were being flooded with water to force out the oil that helped fuel the Soviet Union's voracious military-industrial complex. 2/3 of all Soviet oil output was produced there. It was the jewel in the Soviet system that overall held 40% of the world's gas reserves and 12% of oil reserves outside the Middle East. Most of the oil and gas extracted was sold domestically at fixed low prices, subsidizing the mass production of tanks and other weaponry to arm the Soviet Empire against the West. But the oil exports were more strategic. They were the black gold on which the Soviet Empire's global reach was based. The economy of the East German Republic was mostly funded through the sale of Soviet oil and gas at a fraction of the world market prices, and the rest of the Eastern Bloc was propped up by similar deals. Oil exports in particular were jealously watched over by the KGB. The profits the Soviet state monopoly oil exporter Soyuz-Neftexport made from the difference between the Soviet and world prices, 6 times higher, helped fill the hard currency coffers of the Soviet Empire, funding forays into the Middle East and Africa, stoking armed conflicts and uprisings, and financing active measures to disrupt the West. When the Soviet Union collapsed and the oil ministry's chain of command shattered, the oil industry broke up initially into 4 separate vertically integrated production companies: Lukoil, Yukos, Surgutneftgaz, and, for a time, Rosneft. Though they were still nominally controlled by the state, they were mostly taken over by the directors, the oil generals, who had run them in Soviet times, while organized crime groups running amok in Russia's regional towns tried to muscle their way in. There was a widespread collapse in output, as the oil fields of West Siberia had been largely depleted by the decades of Soviet mismanagement. But, unnoticed in the shadows, in the first half of the 90s, members of the KGB's foreign intelligence arm kept control over the majority of oil exports. Producers had been ordered to sell up to 80% of their output at the fixed low internal price to the state, which then allowed a system of spets-exportery, specially designated exporters allied closely with the KGB or with crony organized crime to reap the difference from the global price. Often the funds this brought in were siphoned for black cash for the KGB and the Kremlin, to fund election campaigns and make sure parliamentary votes went the Kremlin's way, or was simply looted. When the most strategic and lucrative sectors of Soviet industry were sold off in the mid-90s under the loans for shares auctions, many of these gold seams for KGB networks passed into private hands. The likes of Yukos and Sibneft, a neighbouring West Siberian oil producer, were sold into the hands of the young bankers close to the Yeltsin government, to Khodorkovsky and the partnership of Berezovsky and Abramovich for just $300 million and $100 million apiece. The access to capital the young tycoons gained through their bank's management of government treasury accounts helped give them the upper hand in the battle for the country's resources. The KGB operatives were never going to be able to stump up such amounts. The consequences were enormous. Oil, despite the low global prices at that time, still made up a large chunk of the country's export revenues. Khodorkovsky's men, for instance, set up their own trading networks for Yukos as soon as they took over the company in 1996. The profits were stashed in the private offshore accounts of Khodorkovsky's Menatep group, far out of the reach of the Russian state, while Menatep found loopholes in the laws to minimize tax payments. The balance of power was decisively shifting towards the Yeltsin-era tycoons. Their privatization of the oil export cash flow changed everything. It turned the likes of Khodorkovsky and Berezovsky into full-blown oligarchs, able to bribe Yeltsin's men and stack parliamentary votes in their own favor. According to former KGB officer turned oil trader Andrei Panikov, the breakup of the oil trade into independent ownership was a threat to the integrity of the Russian state that should never have happened. I would never have destroyed the state monopoly. I would have kept all the export trading in state hands. For Putin and his KGB men, it was a matter that of course drew their immediate attention. Global oil prices began to surge almost as soon as Putin was anointed Yeltsin's successor in the summer of 1999. By mid-2002, Khodorkovsky, who'd started out as an intense, softly spoken chemistry student running discos for the Komsomol, was announcing to the world a personal fortune of $7 billion through his ownership of a 36% stake in the Menatep Group. It was a colossal leap in fortune, since the days when Menatep acquired Yukos for $300 million in the loans for shares auctions of 1995, when Yukos itself was knee-deep in debt. The disclosure officially made Khodorkovsky Russia's richest man, at a time when the entire Russian state budget was $67 billion, and the market capitalization of Russia's biggest state-controlled company, Gazprom, was $25 billion. Khodorkovsky and his partners in Menatep had been the first Russian tycoons to publicly disclose their business holdings. Most of the oligarchs hid their ownership behind a web of front companies, still fearing retribution from the state after the controversy of the 90s-era privatizations. Khodorkovsky was putting his head over the parapet, partly because Putin's vault to the presidency was meant to signal a legalization of the country's chaotic market transition, a securing of the gains of the 90s. It was one of the reasons Putin had won such broad support, most crucially from the Yeltsin family. Even though he'd ruthlessly taken out the media tycoons, Putin had given no indication that he wanted to increase state ownership anywhere else. And while he'd made plenty of threatening noises about bringing the oligarchs to heel, he'd insisted that he would not overturn the privatizations of the 90s. It seemed that with Khodorkovsky's disclosure, Russia was further progressing on the way to a more mature and developed market economy. The move was lauded as a breakthrough for transparency, but it was also perhaps Khodorkovsky's bet on the power of the market to protect him. He was banking on operating according to Western market rules of the game. But for the Siloviki who'd risen to power with Putin, Khodorkovsky's new status as the country's richest man, operating outside their control, was another red flag. They'd been waiting in the shadows since the Soviet collapse, harboring ambitions to restore Russia's might. Putin's rise to the presidency, through his subtle deception and promises to the Yeltsin family, was meant to be the first step towards achieving that. The KGB men had always seen the country's oil industry as currency in geopolitical power games. In their view, taking control of Russia's oil resources was going to be crucial in both securing their own position in power and in restoring Russia's standing against the West. It didn't hurt, of course, that they would be able to line their own pockets in the process. The question was how they would go about it. Unlike the communists, the new generation of Siloviki from the ranks of the KGB, which had started the market reforms in the first place, were never going to announce a renationalization campaign. They'd always declared themselves in favor of the market, but they aimed to use and distort the market as a weapon. They wanted to establish a form of quasi-state capitalism that would further their own, and as they saw it, Russia's power. The gas industry posed a much easier equation than the oil sector. Unlike oil, it had been preserved almost in its entirety as a vast state-controlled monopoly. Gazprom, the state gas giant, was the country's most strategic asset. Straddling the biggest gas reserves on the planet, it was the world's #1 gas producer, and brought in the country's largest tax revenue stream. It not only provided Russia's homes with heat and light, it also supplied Europe with 25% of its gas needs. Its role as the predominant supplier to much of Central and Eastern Europe, as well as Ukraine and Belarus, meant it could be used as a tool of political influence, while its vast cash pools and financial assets presented a wealth of opportunity for Putin's men. Under Yeltsin, Gazprom's senior management had largely taken control of the company, transforming it into their own fiefdom. But Putin made their replacement with his own allies one of his first priorities. Launching a sweeping purge after shareholder investigations showed the Yeltsin-era managers had siphoned a string of gas fields and other assets out of Gazprom and into companies connected to them. The men he appointed in their place had all served in executive positions at the St. Petersburg seaport, the strategic asset that Putin's Siloviki had taken over, cutting their teeth, joining forces with the Tambov organized crime group. It was the first indication that the alliance forged then would take over assets on a federal scale. Gazprom's new chief executive was 39-year-old Alexei Miller, a short, mustachioed man who'd served as Putin's deputy on the Foreign Relations Committee of the St. Petersburg Mayor's Office and then as a director at the seaport. The privately owned oil industry was going to pose a far more difficult challenge. In St. Petersburg, the Siloviki had been able to easily bend the city's law enforcement to their will to push out rivals. But tackling the Moscow oligarchs was a different matter entirely. For all the power they wielded through the FSB, Putin's followers had not yet consolidated control over the entire system of law enforcement, and the Moscow tycoons were established figures, well known in the West, who'd built companies that were traded on Western markets. At stake was the country's ability to pull in outside investment, which the pragmatic Putin understood was still essential to speed Russia's economic recovery from the 90s collapse. The Siloviki began what became known as Operation Energy quietly. The Yeltsin family continued to feel secure in their belief that Putin was a man of the market. To them, he was the president in training, still learning the ropes of government. In the first year of his rule, he was taking intensive lessons in the English language, in how to speed-read stacks of documents, and in the administration and history of the Russian state, according to a senior KGB-linked banker familiar with the matter, who said, "The system for preparing leaders had collapsed." The Yeltsin family still believed firmly in Putin's loyalty, and in his obedience to them. It seems they also believed they had the run of most of the economy for Putin's first term, while Putin appeared to indicate initially that he didn't intend to serve beyond that. The family felt so comfortable and was so unaware of any ambitions the St. Petersburg KGB men might harbour towards the oil industry that they began to hatch plans to privatize the last remaining state oil major, Rosneft. Roman Abramovich had long been eyeing the company. He and Berezovsky had hoped to merge it into Sibneft when it had first been slated for privatization in 1997. Now that they believed they'd secured their future, said Pugachev, Voloshin had even prepared a decree for Rosneft's privatization that was just awaiting Putin's signature. Behind the scenes, Abramovich had been quietly lobbying to smooth the way. A row of fine Italian suits and shoes had suddenly appeared hanging in the hallway of Putin's Novo Ogarevo residence, courtesy of Abramovich, according to Pugachev. I said, "Volodya, what on earth do you want all this for? You are president of one of the world's biggest countries. Surely you can get your own suits. You don't want these bribes. They will ask for something in return." For Pugachev, Abramovich's overtures had been the final straw. Pugachev believed it was essential to keep the state's last oil company out of the family's hands. As his standing rose due to his role in propelling Putin to power, he'd begun to move fluidly between alliances with Putin's St. Petersburg KGB men and with the Yeltsin family, depending on the political imperative, often keeping his real allegiances hidden. But on this occasion, he began to shift decisively towards the Siloviki. They'd invited the president to Voloshin's dacha. They called him to them. It was absolutely improper, he recalled. I said, "Why are you going there? Why should it be privatized? What are you thinking about? There is no money in the budget. Without Rosneft, how do you intend to live? Where are you going to get wages from?" In the background, the St. Petersburg Siloviki were already building their own defences to keep Rosneft out of private hands. Behind the backs of the Yeltsin family, they'd been quietly putting a parallel system of government in place, according to a senior banker close to the security services. Leading the process was Igor Sechin, Putin's loyal KGB colleague from St. Petersburg, who'd been appointed deputy head of his administration. And further behind the scenes, according to the senior banker, Gennady Timchenko, the alleged former KGB operative and close Putin ally from the St. Petersburg oil terminal. In those days, the banker said, Timchenko was one of the most influential operators in Putin's entourage. He was immediately powerful as soon as Putin was appointed president. But Putin kept him hidden from view. He was like the invisible man. He was never seen, another person close to Putin said. Timchenko, through his lawyers, said any suggestion he was involved in, any project to create a parallel system of government, was utterly false to the point of being absurd. Timchenko has simply never involved himself in political issues, nor discussed political issues with Mr. Putin or any of his staff or ministers. One of the first tasks of this group was to make sure Putin was elected for a second term, regardless of whether he himself was yet convinced that that was what he wanted. To achieve this, they needed to bolster their position in power. Their task was to get their hands on more cash flow, the banker said. They were concerned that the family, Abramovich, were controlling certain sectors of the economy. Meanwhile, in the background, a broader cast of KGB men had long been drawing up lists of targets in the oil sector. Initially at the top of the list was Surgutneftgaz, the West Siberian oil producer run by Vladimir Bogdanov, who'd served as its director since Soviet times. But Bogdanov and Surgutneftgaz had already established a close relationship with Putin's KGB men through Timchenko, whose oil trader had a monopoly on exports from Surgut's Kurishi refinery.